So as Roxanne touched on, I'm going to be talking a little bit about existing trees in the site planning process. For those of you who are not familiar with site planning, I'll do a brief definition of it. It's basically where we look at the whole site and then we decide where the building goes, where the walkway goes, where the parking goes, and why, and how that fits on the site. Landscape architects tend to take trees in mind, but sometimes we have other professionals that work on site planning as well who may not value trees as much. And so sometimes I've found that we end up with a site plan where if the building had been moved just 10 feet in one direction, we could have saved a huge resource of a tree, and they didn't even consider it. Maybe, as I put into the second part of my presentation here, maybe they just didn't have the topo trees on, I'm not sure. So we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits of those trees when it comes to site planning. I have picked some projects to look at that are both good projects, and new trees are definitely worthwhile. We always want to add to the tree canopy, especially in our urban forest, but keeping those larger existing trees is really a resource too. So a lot of the other design professionals might think that, why? We're good with a clean slate, right? Perfect, we can do anything we want right here on this clean, flat piece of land. But you miss the point in all the benefits that existing trees can give us. So character, a lot of trees bigger trees can add character to the site, give it something that's unique to that place. Scale, helps to buffer the scale of a building, bring it back down to pedestrian level, soften things. Shade, I'm sure you're going to hear this many times today, but the shade that mature trees provide is quite a bit different from new installs. They can anchor a space, a park, a building, and give it context into the site. Framing of views and vistas to make those more important by maybe selectively thinning some species and keeping your big framing trees on site. Trees are a resource. They provide cooling, they provide stormwater uptake. They add interest. Sometimes we see pictures of huge architectural buildings with one cutout in the middle and a huge tree right through the middle, and people are like, wow. Instant impact. I've been a part of projects that both keep large trees and those that bring in, 8-meter wide trees to go right into a lawn where it's just that instant impact. So size has an impact. Effect on microclimate and cooling and wind mitigation, and most of all, a sense of place. So as we go through these picture slides, they're all well designed, but the emphasis here is on looking at whether they're mature trees of some size or whether they're newly installed and seeing the difference. So this is just a rendering, but you can see the trees in the background look like they might be on another site. And everything around the building is kind of clean and neat in a naturalized landscape. Whereas this shows how existing trees very close to the building can add context, anchoring. You see the trees there, they have context both in the foreground and in the background, so that building is really set well within the context of that site. As opposed to these little new trees, which are great, and we still need to plant more, as I said, but that compared to this is a big difference. So those existing trees are really important to see if we can save those. This kind of size, you just can't transplant very easily or cost effectively. So keeping a couple of anchoring trees really helps even when you put in a new design and infill with some additional trees. These trees you can barely see. Now in 50 years they're going to be great, but I don't know about the lawn being so pristine. But that compared to this, It has that scale, that size, that shade, that context. These are just little residential backyards as an example, but we have, we have on the left trees that are kind of hidden behind a wooden screen between the block wall and the screen. I have no idea why. We like to squish them in and put them as far back as possible and marginalize them as much as possible. Versus on the right, there's some mature trees where the hammock is growing, and then infill trees, newer ones in front of that. They kind of create a context and a whole different feel. So how do we do that? First, we got to turn on the tree layer on CAD and pay attention to where those existing trees are. Then we need to look at the opportunities, the S went down, sorry. It is there. The functional opportunities and constraints, so we look at slope, we look at shade, we look at wind, we look at travel patterns. Then we look at evaluating the existing species, what they are, what kind of condition they're in, how much value they have, and we prioritize those. Then we look at, grading areas and slope conditions, utilities, the pink line that's just to the left-hand side, and there's another utility up at the top. And then also drainage, and how we need to drain the site once we're post-development. Looking at views, focal points, and screening. Then we develop a plan for how we might want to situate our new development and access it. And then we create a plan for, those yellow triangles are for relocated palms. So where we value the species, it's able to be moved, and yet it can't stay there. Versus all the green circles are things we're going to protect in place because of size, because of species, because they can stay there with all the other new development going on. And we need to protect those. And then the next layer after this is where we plant in addition to that and finish it out. And that's it for me.
What's up, tree people? Thanks, Don. Thanks, Tom, for everything you do. Thanks, Roxanne, for the invite. Thanks, Rick. And, thanks, Ian, for making the trip. That was a beautiful way to start the day. Thank you guys so much. My name is Simon Bussiere. I'm one of the new guys in the landscape program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I'm going to try to do a couple things quickly today. I want to just problematize two things, and I'll try to make 2 points. I might just get to make one, and I'll also I can assign homework. If I don't get through all the slides, you can reach out to me on Twitter at Simon Bussiere, and I will. I've tweeted a link to the slides, so if you want some more information, you can just grab that there. So I want to problematize this idea of the kind of human settlement pattern as a given, and just question whether or not the grid is a real thing. And then I want to also maybe make some points about the idea of landscape as just an image. So it'll be a little bit of a theoretical start, and then maybe we can get to a couple of principles in the end that maybe examine opportunities for a kind of convergence of ecological principles and some of the stuff that we can do as designers. So we, I think, take this for granted, right? This sort of economic machine that we all live in. The original survey was drawn by some guy on a horse that was drawing, lines arbitrarily without much concern for the ecology beneath. We see the adverse impacts of this. I have an Australian example. I was a landscape architect, worked on eGate for about a year when I was at AECOM. So we see this all over the world, and this was meant with good intentions. Everybody gets a little piece of everything, and that single-family detached dwelling kind of tessellation across the landscape was a good idea, but we're not always alert to the consequences of our good intentions. It's kind of an Achilles heel of ours. And we don't really care until something bad happens, right? But the pattern that we see beneath, it's not just a subversive kind of social or cultural pattern beneath in the ecology, but it's a real pattern, as we can see from major storm events that occur. So this coincides with our FEMA maps. We're not completely blind. If we look at a map like this from our colleagues at CTAR, or this map here, we can see actually where, I don't know if this is a laser, anyway, the laser doesn't work. But we can see that that pattern is a remnant of the underlying ecology beneath. And we have, I think, an opportunity to examine these two things in concert. So here we are in the city today. And I also want to just problematize this notion of a novel ecosystem and just say something about what it means to plant natives on fill soil. Filling is a necessary and messy thing that we do. We're engineers of new pieces of land. And I want to just draw a distinction between those two palettes of materials. There's certain characteristics that exist in fill soil and certain characteristics that exist in native soil. And it's very difficult to plant native plants on fill. It's coral dredge, it's whatever, got certain characteristics that I encourage you to check out. But basically there's a biology to soil that we need to build our landscapes on and in concert with. So I want to reinforce what was said this morning and argue, I think it's been effectively argued in the past, and I'd like to continue that argument that this is the natural succession, which means there's success, and that there's success that builds on success over time, is a given. We are also, I think, faced with an opportunity where we have to think about what the city is, and in many cases, the city's got to do with population density, but for us as well, we're concerned with impervious surface. So ecologists like the definition that an urban context is greater than 30% impermeable. We also have many plants that do okay, that are not, that didn't come over from the earliest settlers in canoes, and also didn't come over by luck. But some plants that are pre-adapted to dealing with some of these major urban problems. Some of the native endemic plants that we use are somewhat resilient to episodic disturbances like a flood or a quick storm, but they're not so well resilient to the chronic disturbances like atmospheric deposits from some of the maquiladoras in Mexico that we get picked up from the trade winds, or some of these other like issues such as sea level rise and other climate change linked factors. So I want to problematize that sort of binary, the native is good and the invasive is bad, in the context of the urban situation. And I want to take a broader view within urban regions and assume a kind of gradient and look for suitability and kind of middle ground. This is being argued by a lot of biologists and landscape ecologists. So Peter Del Tredici is the director of the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard. And he says that the vegetation of most cities is as cosmopolitan as its human population. And so this is just nature, it's happening. It's not mediated by maintenance regimes or design considerations. This is a trend, this is from my hometown in Boston, but basically from 1850, we had a number and percentage of non-native species of plants, and that's a trend. So the number is actually not going down. We can manage certain things, like the great work at Lyon Arboretum or other highly managed spaces, but natural succession is actually happening all around us. So we can talk about what used to grow here. I love this I just took out the window over Los Angeles the other day, and it's actually really difficult to talk about putting native plants in that context. So we have an opportunity to deal with that. So I want to give you a quick lesson. This is Peter Del Tredici's taxonomy of urban landscapes. So we want to put this into three categories. We've got basically a remnant. These are patches of existing climax vegetation. We have managed landscapes. These are more common than any of the other in an urban context, but this is basically the urban landscape that's modified and heavily maintained, and we're familiar with the kind of the aesthetic beauty of that and all that entails. And what I'm more interested in is actually the leftover bits. So ruderal, or actually in Latin rudis, it means literally broken stone. And what we're going to look at in the next couple slides are the kind of scraps, the like interstitial remnant spaces that are, in fact, not just to be considered abandoned, but think of them as available and think of them as important parts of the infrastructure of the city. So these are all around us, and they pop up whether we want them to or not. And often the vegetation that exists there is thriving and is an index of the kind of impact that it can produce. There's a lot of these kinds of spaces. This is basically just a list of the types of environments that are kind of marginal, that are not like beautifully maintained, like this gorgeous golf course out the window, or some of the stuff in Waikiki, but they're like, you know, little leftover bits that we sometimes overlook. They do provide ecosystem services, all the good stuff we've been talking about, fixing nitrogens, cooling the city, you know, changing colors and doing sort of beautiful things. Erosion control is really important, and many other cultural significances as well. And so just to the first point, that we think about the grid and we think about the kind of ecology that exists and is kind of coming back through that grid regardless of what we want it to do. I want us to look for what's to come. I want us to think about the future and try to design and manage for it by promoting plant communities and by thinking about what we can do with this real succession that's happening all around us. We call them weeds. Peter Del Tredici calls them spontaneous urban vegetation. It's a fancier word for it. And, I think it's okay. Okay, maybe if I've got time for one more quick point. I timed myself. Here we go. I'm a little bit over. But here's the idea. This is the Webster definition of landscape. It's all the visible, blah blah blah, or you know, like your portrait in landscape. Well, I think that a lot of what we do that's I think problematic in landscape and in design of landscapes is think about it just as an image and less as a system that we're a part of. Ecology is an interaction between organisms and their surrounding, and so this is I think a conflict, and it results from our kind of appreciation for the beauty of landscape. So rather than trying to always idealize a kind of like an idyllic pastoral scene or like a fresco or one of these beautiful paintings with this kind of atmosphere, I want us to think about the landscape as a broader, more dynamic, self-regulating thing that accrues over time. It's inhabited, it connects everything. And if you're interested in this topic, you can look to landscape urbanism, which is a theory of urban planning that argues that the best way to organize cities is actually through the city's landscape, rather than just its sort of economic drivers like real estate development and so forth. It's really a postmodernist response or critique to the failings of new urbanism, which you're probably familiar with. It's like the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker and putting all the pieces back in the downtowns. It's difficult to put the toothpaste back in the tube, but that's another topic. And I'll just mention a couple of quick projects that have inspired some of my work. This on a riverbank in Bordeaux by Michel Devine. And the trees as green fingers and green infrastructure is a really powerful message. I'll just give you a very quick project in Nicaragua I've been working on since 2008. And we're at about the same latitude, which is nice. And so I'll cruise right into this topic here. So when we think about site organization, you can think about, back to that image of the single-family detached dwellings as a kind of, you know, let's say homogeneous sort of platting out of parcels. Or you can think about it as clusters. And I want to argue that one of the best ways you can do that is by looking at existing vegetation and by programming the site, by threading infrastructure through existing trees. So here, a grid that we developed is based primarily on existing sacred trees. These are mangoes and tamarindos and papayas, star fruits and so forth. And what we tried to do is develop a community center around these. So basically jamming all the normal programming you would do into a housing and community project, but based primarily around the trees. So in black here you see a big beautiful mango tree that acts as a community center. I don't have the time to go into the guts of this, but basically the kind of overlapping and sort of systematic overlaying of programs and activities and all the design of social exchange and interaction that we try to provide as designers for a community is threaded through the existing vegetation on the site. So essentially the layout is provided, and then what we try to do is have kids actually plant all these trees that are coming in that are new. So any new tree requires a team of kids who will come in and plant those trees. So we can do this. We can look at the grid. We can critique it. We can look at, you know, some great Landsat images. We can see what canopy we have that's available. But we can also think about the canopy as an index of what's below. We can think about it like a diagram that describes the ecology that's hidden beneath. And rather than necessarily just relying on the grid all the time and decorating it, as we often do, I think, to our peril, I think we can look and appreciate what's hidden. I love this effort of the exceptional trees in Hawaii, and I was so shocked to see that this wasn't a bigger index, because so much of the vegetation in the city is so exceptional. Just walking from my home down the LOI this morning, I wish all those coconut trees were exceptional. I wish all of the plumeria were exceptional. And I would love to fill this in. So I have great students right now at UH that are doing this kind of work. Some of my undergraduate students dealing with the Kapalama Canal, and some of my graduate students dealing with the LOI watershed and looking at these broader issues. If you're interested in landscape ecology, I would recommend Richard Foreman. And some more text on the subject can be found at your local bookstore. And I would also encourage you guys to reach out if anybody's interested in pursuing a Master of Landscape Architecture degree. Just up the road here, and I will leave you there.
I'm going to give a talk on diversity and some of the challenges. I'm a landscape architect, and so some of the things that the challenges and opportunities that I face in my practice with our urban forest. So we talked a little bit about the dangers of a monoculture for urban forests, and we have a tendency to do that, and there's reasons why, and it's kind of interesting to see why we're kind of directed towards a monoculture forest. The uniformity creates a sense of identity. A monoculture forest also is plants, as a designer, I know they're going to be available. If I'm using the same old stuff, I know the nurseries are propagating it. And I understand the maintenance requirements. And there's city standards that the monocultural approach kind of fits into in terms of spacing and specifications. One big concern that affects my design is liability concerns, and that really kind of directs a monoculture approach. And I'll get into that a little bit more, but that's a big one. It's difficult to try new things and different things, and our Honolulu urban forest people are very very aware of liability concerns, dropping fruit and seeds and stuff that can create a problem. And then also, frankly, if we stick to the same old stuff, then we're less likely to introduce invasive species. And so over time, because of these things, we tend to get narrowed down to a small selection over time in urban forest. But there's disadvantage to a monoculture, as many of us are certainly aware of. The lack of genetic diversity obviously exposes our monoculture urban forest to devastating impact on disease. This photo on the right is at McKinley High School. Those were the ficus Chinese banyan trees. Recently attacked by stem gall and low-bait laxgill. A monoculture forest does not help protect biodiversity. It does not celebrate biodiversity. It creates kind of a sameness over the landscape so that different parts of Honolulu look the same because it's the same forest, the same canopy everywhere. And it's certainly less adaptable to climate change. And so monoculture is bad. We need to increase diversity. And so the constraints, though, on increasing diversity is that there's limited availability. It's a catch-22 with nurseries. They don't want to grow what's not being specified and not where there's no demand. And then landscape architects don't want to specify things that are not available. And so it's a catch-22. And so as landscape architects, we need to work with the nurseries and kind of figure out a way to get by that conundrum. And then I mentioned liability concerns. It's such a big concern. For me as a landscape architect, it's easy for me to defer to liability concerns and not take chances. And also maintenance concerns. trying different things can increase maintenance. And frankly, as designers, we get kind of lazy. We know the plants, we don't try to learn new things. So we need to get past that. And then, as I mentioned, there's design codes and requirements. And also aesthetics kind of figure into it. We're kind of stuck in a rut on our image of Honolulu and our aesthetic sense. We have this image of what the city should be. In many ways, I don't think it's appropriate aesthetically. I think we need to celebrate the uniqueness of our own endemic plants. But there's limitations to that and challenges to that too. So the current status, actually, if you look at the data, just the raw data, we have a great diversity in our urban forest. We have over 200 plants in our urban forest right now, by number. But by canopy, it's a little bit different picture. So like 15% plus or minus of our canopy is monkeypot trees. But in certain areas of town, in certain core areas, it's much greater percentage than that with monkeypot trees. Shower trees about 8%, something like that. We have a wide diversity that exists in its potential in Hawaii, but we tend to limit that diversity. And we have only a few species kind of dominating the core areas of our area. And one thing I find is that we're replacing big trees with small trees that stay small, or that grow much smaller. And so there's a trend towards small trees, and maybe that's why our canopies are increasing. We are decreasing. We can increase the number of trees, but decrease the canopy size. And so that's kind of a trend that is we're facing right now. So here's the usual suspects, of course, the monkeypod, shower tree, Tacoma trees. Ko'u is an endemic tree. I see that being used a lot lately. Here's the small canopy trees trending. There's Harpullia and the white Tacoma. These are great trees. They're very low maintenance. They're not aggressive roots. They're clean. They're slow. And so in many years, the white Tacoma can get to be a very nice big tree, but it's more vertical than spreading. It doesn't really have the canopy. What I'm hoping is that, like in parking lots, we're kind of forced to use small trees in parking lots. We have to. We really don't have a choice. We can't plant monkeypod trees and shower trees and stuff in parking lots anymore. Liability concerns and maintenance concerns, root upheaval of paving is just too much. And so what I'm hoping is that maybe in the near future, with the advent of ride sharing with self-driving vehicles, we'll need less parking spaces, and we can capture some of those parking spaces for bigger trees. And maybe the technology will help us in that sense. We're all familiar with the willy-willy trees. This is a non-native erythrina, but that was hit by the walrus. There's a big one in the Bishop Square that's gone. As we lose some of our urban forests because of the impacts of invasive pests and stuff, it's an opportunity for us to increase diversity, to come back and increase diversity. So for example, the erythrina tree in Bishop Square was replaced with a mahogany tree, which is kind of nice because there's not much mahogany trees right in urban downtown Honolulu, so kind of increasing the diversity. This is what happened though with the erythrina. This is out of Kapolei. They all died, they were all removed, and then this is the current status of that same area. Now I'm cheating a little bit because they had to add turning lanes, and so there's other reasons why they couldn't have big trees here. But that's an unfortunate missed opportunity when we have to replace our urban forests with when they fail. Again, this is McKinley High School. This is a good example. I think the ficus trees on the left all died. They have to be replaced. So they replaced them with yellow trumpet trees, or golden trumpet trees, which is not that common. It's a little different than gold tree or silver trumpet tree. The golden trumpet tree is a little different, and it's going to create in time, this is an image from the Department of Education of simulating what it would look like. So it's going to create this strong dramatic statement of identity right there with something a little bit different. And so that's an example of an opportunity that was taken to increase the diversity. One thing I wanted to mention, because I think it's off the radar and is kind of, to me, it's kind of interesting, and that's the way we propagate our urban forest, our monoculture urban forest. Much of it is propagated vegetatively through air layering and through cuttings. And so the Hong Kong orchid tree, Singapore plumeria tree, the shower tree, even the banyan trees, I think to a great extent are, well, most of those are entirely propagated vegetatively. There's a problem with that because when you take a cutting of a cutting, you weaken the plant a little bit. And so, like with Singapore plumeria, I don't know, perhaps 100, 150 years ago, a branch was brought to Hawaii. That branch probably was already a cutting of a cutting of a cutting. And so then when we grew that, all the Singapore plumerias we have everywhere in town are from that original first plant that was brought to Hawaii, that one single plant. And so these trees here are cuttings of a cutting that was grown somewhere else in town, and then the cuttings were taken that and planted somewhere previously or from somewhere else in town. Each time you take a cutting and you plant it somewhere else and you take a cutting from that, the tree is weaker. It accumulates viruses. The viruses don't kill it, but they slowly, incrementally weaken it. This is something that in horticulture is well known, like in the rose growers and vineyards. They are adamant about getting virus-free stock. We're completely ignorant of that, and that may be causing our forest to self-destruct because our viruses can help encourage insect damage, because viruses can cause the plant to create a chemical signal which attracts detrimental insects because the virus wants to be spread, right? And so things like our plumeria trees and other trees, are they more prone to insects now because they're colonal cuttings? And also the lack of genetic diversity by doing that makes them less resistant to change. For climate change, is less adaptable. So just something I thought I'd mention because I haven't heard it really mentioned before much, but it's something I'm kind of tracking. So the solutions, we need more research. I know that UH is doing some great jobs on researching. I see Professor Criley here. He's got a booth in the back there on expanding tree diversity in Hawaii. They've got some great publications to help get information on alternative trees and stuff to use. And that helps to identify the underused but appropriate species. Another pet peeve of mine is planting in groupings. I'd like to see that done more instead of regimental things, because planting in groupings allows for interesting different combinations and different plants that we might not normally be able to use as single trunk standard trees, and allowing for different standards and a shift in aesthetics and liability. That's a tough one. I mean, maybe we need some kind of tort reform for urban trees. Here's just an image of clustering. I thought this was interesting because I pulled this almost the same image as Dawn. Dawn had on her cover that same image of kukui trees, a different photograph, but we're taken from the same spot. And so we're connecting there somehow with the concept of planting in clusters that allows for accumulating. I mean, you can do things. I could spend an hour just on that topic, so I'll pass. Anyway, that's the end of the topic.